The sun dipped behind the mountains, leaving the sky tinged with orange and crimson. In the small outpost town of Fairbridge, dusk had always meant the end of the day, a time to rest. But not anymore. For the last 3 weeks, the darkness had brought with it more than just cold wind, it brought them. Nobody knew where they came from. They weren't the mindless creatures from legends. These things were smart. They coordinated. They waited until the sun was completely gone, then moved like a storm through the outskirts of human settlements. And now, they were headed toward Fairbridge. Major Elena Rowe stood atop the steel watchtower, binoculars clutched tightly in her gloved hands. Her eyes scanned the dense tree-line that circled the north ridge. The town's generator hummed below, casting flickering yellow lights over the checkpoint barriers and sandbag bunkers. Every hour of power had to be carefully rationed, but tonight, this night, they needed it. "Nothing yet," Elena said into her radio. Captain Malik's voice crackled through the static. "They'll come when the last light fades." Just like before. Behind her, the base was alive with tension. Civilians stayed underground in the storm shelters. Only the volunteer fighters and the remnants of the regional defense unit were above ground now. Less than 70 soldiers stood ready to face whatever was coming. And not one of them had forgotten what happened in Silverdale, a fortified city reduced to silence in just 2 nights. The world had changed without warning. Some said it started with a failed experiment in the old Siberian labs. Others whispered it was a plague released from beneath melting ice. But none of it mattered anymore. The infection spread fast, devouring cities, towns, even military outposts. Fairbridge had become one of the last safe zones on the western ridge. And now it was their turn. As the last glow of the sun vanished from the horizon, the radio went silent for a few heartbeats. Then came the first sound, a single sharp thud against the perimeter gate. Elena froze. Contact. North wall. Another impact. Then another. Heavy. Rhythmic. "They're here," Malik's voice came again. Calm, but tight with tension. "Hold your lines. No one fires until you see them. We need to count how many made it this far." Elena took her position on the wall, raising her rifle with practiced ease. Her breath slowed. Her heartbeat didn't. The fog had rolled in unusually thick, clinging to the trees like a curtain. Movement flickered in the mist, shapes, tall and crooked, some on 2 legs, some crouching low, like animals. Then they emerged. The creatures didn't run. They stalked. Human-like, but wrong. Faces stretched with cracked skin and hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. Some wore tattered remains of clothing, like a cruel reminder of who they once were. And behind the first wave, more followed, dozens, maybe hundreds. Elena's finger hovered over the trigger. "Permission to open fire?" "No," Malik ordered. "Not yet. Let them get closer." The gate creaked as the first creature pressed its weight against it. Others joined. Their claws scraped metal. Their eyes scanned the towers, as if analyzing. Waiting. Suddenly, a loud alarm erupted from the western barricade. Another voice came through the radio. "They're flanking. Multiple hostiles on the west. We're surrounded." Elena cursed under her breath. "They're testing our weaknesses." "Exactly," Malik replied grimly. "They're learning." With a shriek, the first creature leapt at the gate, and the rest followed like a wave. The ground shook under their charge. Elena didn't wait for another command. "Fire." Gunshots cracked the silence. Muzzle flashes lit up the barricades. The undead hissed and snarled as they fell, but more came. From the east. From the south. From the skyline itself. They'd never come from all directions before. Something was different tonight. This wasn't a mindless horde. This was a coordinated strike. And Fairbridge might not survive it. Bullets tore through the night air. The scent of gunpowder and rotting flesh mixed in the cold wind. Spotlights swept over the battlefield, revealing wave after wave of the undead closing in. It wasn't just a frontal assault, Fairbridge was being encircled. Major Elena Rowe barked orders through her radio, moving along the northern wall, rifle slung over her shoulder, sidearm in hand. Fall back to the secondary line. Don't let them split us. The gate was holding, barely, but the west side had already begun to crumble. Reports came in of breaches along the chain-link fencing. The creatures weren't just clawing through, they were working together, stacking debris, pushing against weak points. Like wolves testing a herd's defenses. From the command tent, Captain Malik watched the wall cams and live drone feeds, eyes sharp and jaw clenched. The images confirmed it, these weren't random attacks. Something, or someone, was guiding them. Activate perimeter mines. Lock down the inner zone. We can't let them reach the shelters. A massive boom echoed from the west. Dust and sparks rained down. A breach. Then screaming. Private Denny's voice rang out over the radio, panicked and distorted. They're inside. The west wall is down, repeat, they're inside the perimeter. Elena's boots pounded against metal as she raced toward the breach. From her position, she could see the silhouettes of infected flooding through a gap in the barricade. She reached the corner turret just in time to see 5 soldiers being overwhelmed, one of them dragged screaming into the fog. Elena fired. Her sidearm flashed again and again until the clip was empty. The creatures scattered for cover. Cover. That wasn't something zombies should use. Behind her, Sergeant Rivas arrived with a squad of reinforcements, dragging a heavy pulse repeater into place. We hold them here or we fall. Do it, Elena said, grabbing another rifle off a fallen soldier. We hold. The gunfire resumed, louder, closer. The undead didn't retreat. They adapted. Some crawled under vehicles. Others climbed wreckage to leap from above. It was chaos. But the soldiers fought harder. Because they knew, if Fairbridge fell, the shelters below would be next. Inside one of those shelters, 15-year-old Cody Allen sat in silence, gripping his younger sister's hand. His father was a mechanic, now stationed at the generator room to keep the power running. His mother had vanished during the fall of Stanton City. All Cody knew was this: the noise up above wasn't just a fight. It was war. A loud knock echoed against the shelter hatch. Then another. The civilians froze. One of the guards approached the door, rifle ready. Who's there? Silence. Then, a voice. Help, please, let me in. A woman's voice, weak and trembling. Someone who hadn't made it to the shelter in time? Or a trap? The guard hesitated. Cody stood. Wait, something's wrong. He wasn't sure how he knew. Maybe it was the stories. Maybe it was instinct. But something felt off. The voice was too calm. Too steady. Then, another knock, harder. And another. Then dozens. From all sides. They're here, the guard yelled. Above ground, Elena could hear the same thing over the comms, unusual tapping against the reinforced shelter doors. It wasn't random scratching. It was rhythmic. Coordinated. Like code. She turned to Malik on the radio. They're not just attacking. They're probing. They're trying to breach the underground. We have to assume they know where we keep the civilians, Malik said grimly. Evac plans? We have none, she said. This was supposed to be our last stand. As the creatures began withdrawing from the outer perimeter, only to regroup again in eerie formation, Elena's heart sank. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were targets. And whatever controlled these creatures, it wasn't done yet. The atmosphere inside Fairbridge's command tent was heavy, thick with the oppressive weight of uncertainty. Elena leaned over a makeshift map of the town, her fingers tracing the perimeter lines. Malik stood behind her, looking over her shoulder, eyes narrowed, jaw set in a grim line. "They're pulling back," Malik said quietly. "Not retreating, reorganizing." Elena frowned, gripping the edge of the table. "But why?" "They've breached the walls. They've got us outnumbered." "Exactly." Malik's voice was firm. "But they're still holding back. They want something more." A sudden burst of static came from the radio. "We've got movement," a scout reported, his voice crackling. "Multiple figures advancing from the east. But this isn't just a horde. There are leaders with them." Elena's heart skipped a beat. The word leaders felt like a dagger. "They've always been mindless before." "Are you sure?" she asked. "Negative, Major. These ones are different. They're moving in formation, staying in the shadows. But they've got purpose." The call ended abruptly. Elena's gaze met Malik's. He didn't need to speak, the realization was clear. The undead had evolved. Adapted. And if they were learning to lead, that meant they weren't just a threat anymore, they were becoming something much worse. "We need to find out what they want," Elena said, her voice low, as though the very words carried weight. "The shelter's underground, but the surface is where the fight's at. If we don't know what's coming next." "I'll take a team out," Malik said immediately. "If they're leading this assault, we'll find them and take them down before they can organize a second wave." Elena shook her head. "Not yet. We need to know more first. If we go in blind." "We won't," Malik interrupted, his tone flat. "We can't afford to wait. Not when they've breached our defenses. Not when they've breached our families." The word stung. Elena exhaled sharply, and for a long moment, she looked out the tent's flaps toward the edge of town. The silhouettes of the undead, still lurking in the shadows, seemed to watch every movement. She could feel their eyes, even from a distance. "We take a small squad," she said after a beat. "But we don't risk it. We'll use the drones first. Get a clear read on their position." Above ground, in the chilling fog that blanketed the town, Sergeant Rivas and his squad moved cautiously from one barricade to the next. Their boots crunched on the snow-dusted ground, the night air biting through their jackets. The fog made everything seem distant and unnervingly quiet. The usual growls, moans, and hisses of the undead had ceased. Even the wind had died down. Rivas stopped, holding up a hand. "Something's wrong. This isn't normal. Where's the sound?" Private Sykes, a fresh recruit, shivered next to him. "It's too quiet, Sergeant. I don't like this." Rivas nodded grimly, his senses alert. Then, through the thick fog, a sound reached them, a low, drawn-out howl. It was distant at first, but it echoed through the eerie silence, sending a chill down every spine. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't the typical shriek of a zombie. It was a command. "Move, now!" Rivas barked, as the squad instinctively followed his orders. They picked up the pace, weapons raised, eyes darting back and forth through the dense mist. They had no idea what was waiting for them. At the eastern ridge, the drone feed flickered into life. The night vision showed a sprawling mass, more organized than any wave of zombies the team had seen. But this time, there was something new. Some of the figures were standing tall, their movements deliberate and measured. They weren't stumbling like the others. Elena stared at the screen, eyes widening as she watched the footage. "They're leading." The images zoomed in, showing the creatures at the forefront. They weren't just infected, they were different. Their movements were fluid, their gaze intense, as though they were scanning, calculating. Some had signs of past injuries, claw marks, scars, but none of them appeared to be faltering. Elena leaned closer to the screen, barely breathing. "We've got no time. Get the team ready. We're going after them." At the same time, inside the shelter, Cody watched with wide, terrified eyes as his father rushed to the door, pushing a heavy steel barricade in place. His sister, Lily, was huddled under a blanket, hands over her ears. "Cody," his father's voice broke through the panic, "we need to move. Now." "Where?" Cody asked, his voice trembling. He knew it was too late to escape. Too late to run. "To the underground safe zone," his father said urgently. "There's no time to waste. The perimeter's falling." But Cody knew something else. He could feel the change in the air. The calm before a storm. Whatever was coming, they weren't just here to attack. They had a plan. And Fairbridge wasn't prepared. The quiet had returned, but not the calm. Major Elena Rowe stood at the front of the command tent, her back straight and her hands clenched behind her. The latest drone footage showed the group of leader zombies in perfect formation, clustered around something, though the image was too blurry to make out details. Their movements were almost intelligent. The thought that these creatures had become a threat capable of planning sent a cold shiver down her spine. She glanced at Captain Malik, who had just come back from organizing the squad. His face was grim, his jaw tense. "They're close," Malik said quietly, as though he had been reading her thoughts. "We have to move, Major." Elena turned to the map again. The perimeter was still holding, barely, and the barricades were being reinforced. But the fog outside was closing in, and the night was growing deeper, colder. Time was slipping away. "We'll move at first light," Elena decided, her voice cold and sure. "We're sending a team to track those leaders. If we can catch them off guard, we might still have a chance." "You think they're just leading a horde?" Malik asked, eyebrows furrowing. "No," Elena replied. "I think they're planning something. They're not mindless. These aren't the creatures we're used to. They have purpose, and that makes them dangerous." Before Malik could reply, the radio crackled again, this time more urgently. "Major Rowe, you need to hear this." The voice on the other end was frantic, the sounds of explosions and gunfire in the background. "We've got reports of infected advancing from the south. They're using tactics, Major. They're not just rushing in, they're coordinating." The words echoed in Elena's mind. Coordinating. This wasn't just an outbreak anymore. It was a full-scale siege. "We're losing the south wall," another voice added, more distant. "There's no way we can hold out there much longer." The news hit hard, but Elena had no time for panic. She couldn't afford it, not now. Get the civilians into the underground tunnels. Move them quickly. We can't risk them being trapped here. Elena's mind raced as she turned to Malik. He nodded and quickly began barking orders to the men and women around them. His face, usually calm and collected, was now set in a steely resolve. "The rest of US will hold the line," Elena continued. "We'll reinforce the south wall and secure the barricades. Stay sharp, and don't let anything through. We'll move out at dawn. We take the leaders down." Elsewhere in the town, Sergeant Rivas and his squad pressed forward through the fog, weapons raised and eyes scanning every shadow. The eerie silence of the undead surrounding them felt almost unnatural. The wind had picked up, carrying the faintest sounds of shrieks and guttural moans from beyond the town's perimeter. But these sounds were different from before. They had purpose. Rivas paused at the base of a ruined building, holding a hand up. "Spread out. Watch your corners." Private Sykes, the new recruit, still looked like he hadn't quite gotten used to the reality of war. His eyes were wide, his hands trembling as he clutched his weapon. The tension was palpable. "We'll make it," Rivas said with forced confidence, his voice low but steady. "Stick together. Watch your six." Sykes nodded, but his fear was obvious. Rivas couldn't blame him. The undead weren't supposed to act like this. Their irregular movement patterns, their intelligence, it didn't make sense. But they were still dangerous, and that was all that mattered. As the squad moved deeper into the shadows, a faint glimmer of movement caught Rivas' eye. It was quick, too quick. Then, more movement. A blur. "Wait," he whispered. "Hold up." They all froze. Then, the unmistakable sound of breathing. Rivas turned toward the noise, his heart racing, and gestured for the others to move into position. Whatever was out there was human, or something trying to sound like it. Without warning, the creatures appeared. But these weren't the usual zombies. They were different. They wore tattered, once human clothing. Some were missing limbs, others had grotesque scars, and all of them had the same eerie, unnerving stillness in their movements. They didn't charge, they stood, eerily calm, watching. And then, at the very center of the group, something far more terrifying appeared. A figure, taller than the rest, its face a twisted parody of humanity. The leader. It raised its head, slowly, as though sensing the soldier's presence. Its hollow eyes met Rivas' gaze, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then, with a guttural command, the leader raised one hand. The zombies moved. The squad opened fire, the crack of gunshots shattering the stillness. But the leader moved with speed and precision. In a blink, it was on Rivas, its hand lashing out with terrifying strength, knocking his rifle from his grip. Rivas fell back, barely catching himself as the creature lunged. The squad rushed to his aid, but the leader's eyes glinted with something more than hunger. It was like it was controlling the horde, directing them. Rivas managed to kick the creature off him, scrambling to his feet, but the horde was closing in. "We need backup," he shouted into his radio, his voice hoarse with desperation. Back at the command center, Elena's eyes flickered to the screens. The leader they had just spotted on the drone feed had a plan. And now, it was clear. The undead weren't just attacking, they were coordinating to wipe out humanity. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, each minute feeling heavier than the last. Major Elena Rowe paced back and forth inside the command tent, eyes flickering from the maps to the radio, which was eerily silent. The sounds of distant gunfire and the occasional explosion had become the soundtrack of their survival. Malik stood by the entrance, eyes scanning the horizon, his body tense. "We're running out of time," he muttered. Elena nodded. The situation was deteriorating faster than they had anticipated. The leader zombies, like the one Rivas had encountered, were evolving beyond anything they had faced. They weren't just more intelligent, they were calculating, methodical. Each move they made, each step they took, felt like it had a purpose, like the undead were learning. "They're building up to something," Elena said, voice barely above a whisper. "It's more than just an attack. They're organizing, preparing for the final push." Malik turned toward her, his expression grim. "And we're stuck in the middle of it." The situation was clear, humanity was running out of options. The barricades were holding for now, but for how much longer? The undead were relentless, and the once secure walls of the town now seemed like fragile barriers against an unstoppable force. "We've lost contact with Rivas' squad," a voice from the radio interrupted Elena's thoughts. "We're hearing more shots, but no response. It's chaos out there." Elena's heart skipped a beat. Rivas and his team had been the first to go on the offensive against the zombies, but now, it seemed like they were trapped. "Get me a visual," Elena snapped, her voice urgent. The screens flickered to life, showing static-filled footage from the town's south perimeter. The flickering lights revealed shadows moving, too many shadows. There were zombies in the streets. No, not just zombies. Leaders, those same terrifying figures who had been directing the horde. The leader in the center of the group turned toward the camera, its hollow eyes locking with Elena's through the screen. It was a chilling moment. For a fraction of a second, Elena swore she could hear the leader's eerie command in the silence of the tent. It was like it was aware of her. Of them. "They're moving in," Malik said, his voice low and thick with tension. "It's only a matter of time before they reach the walls." Elena swallowed hard, her mind racing. "We need a plan." On the streets, Sergeant Rivas and his squad were barely holding on. The leader zombie that had attacked them earlier had disappeared into the shadows, but the horde didn't relent. They just kept coming. "We've got to fall back," Private Sykes panted, his voice full of fear. "There's no way we can win this fight." Rivas, his uniform torn and bloodstained from several close calls, clenched his fists. He could feel the weight of every decision bearing down on him. "We're not running yet. We hold the line as long as we can." But even as he spoke, more of the leader zombies emerging from alleyways and across rooftops, their glowing eyes never leaving the soldiers. They were everywhere now, a web of undead intelligence surrounding them. And then, the impossible happened. The ground beneath their feet trembled. Rivas barely had time to react as the earth cracked open, and the ground gave way. A massive hole had opened up beneath the street. The squad was thrown to the ground, debris flying everywhere as a large part of the road crumbled into nothing. "Get up!" Rivas shouted, pulling himself to his feet. His squad was still recovering, but they couldn't afford to waste a moment. They had to move. Through the dust and smoke, Rivas caught sight of the leader again. This time, it wasn't just one, it was flanked by several more, moving as one, their faces twisted into grotesque expressions. The squad tried to retreat, but every step felt like it took them deeper into the trap. The streets were now a war zone, the ground shifting, the air filled with a horrible sense of inevitability. Back in the command tent, Elena felt a deep sense of foreboding. The radio crackled again, and the voice that came through was strained. "We're losing ground at the south wall. The leader zombies are inside. We can't hold them back much longer." The realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. Rivas was right, they couldn't hold the perimeter. The walls would fall soon, and then it would be total chaos. The horde would flood in, and the town would be overrun. "We can't stop them," Malik said, his voice filled with regret. "Not with the resources we have left." Elena looked at him, her mind running through their options. There was only one way left to fight back. "We make our stand here. At the core of the town." Malik raised an eyebrow. "You're not serious." "I am," Elena replied, her voice firm. "If we can draw them into the heart of the town, we can use the buildings to our advantage. The barricades and walls might be down, but the streets, those we control." Malik paused, considering her words. "It's a last-ditch effort." "Exactly. If we fail, we'll take as many of them with us as we can." Outside, the rumbling continued, the sound of collapsing buildings and the distant cries of the wounded. Elena's heart sank as the final battle began to unfold. The town was slipping away from them. But this wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for the future. For humanity. And they were going to give everything to win. The town was on the brink of collapse. The streets, once filled with the sounds of life, were now a haunting silence punctuated only by the distant moans of the undead. Major Elena Rowe stood on the makeshift command platform, staring out at the encroaching darkness. The leader zombies had broken through the defenses, their eerie eyes glowing from the shadows as they led their horde into the heart of the town. The survivors were scattered, their numbers dwindling. There was no more time to think. "We're out of options," Malik said, his voice heavy with the weight of defeat. "The barricades are gone. We've lost the south wall. If we don't act fast, we'll all be overrun." Elena turned to him, her expression set in grim determination. "We can still win this, Malik. We still have a chance." Malik gave her a skeptical look. "And how do you propose we do that?" "With what? We've got a handful of survivors left and a town full of the dead breathing down our necks." "We use what we have left," Elena replied, her voice firm. "We draw them into the heart of the town. The old city center is still standing. We set traps, we fight back with everything we've got, and we make them pay for every inch they take." Malik seemed to consider her words for a moment, then nodded slowly. "It's the only plan we've got. What do we do first?" Elena's eyes narrowed as she surveyed the town on the screen. "We need to lure them in. We take out the leaders first. If we can eliminate them, the horde will be more manageable. It won't be easy, but it's our best shot." Malik gestured for the remaining soldiers to gather their weapons. "All right, we're with you. Let's make this count." In the streets, Sergeant Rivas and his squad were in full retreat, moving as quickly as they could without drawing too much attention. The leader zombies were relentless in their pursuit, but they were methodical, as though they knew the squad was weakening. "Stay low," Rivas hissed, motioning for his team to take cover behind a crumbled building. He could hear the slow, steady march of the undead as they closed in. His heart pounded in his chest, but he pushed the fear aside. He knew the survivors had no choice but to keep moving, to keep fighting. "We've got to reach the city center," he said to his team. "It's our last shot." We regroup there. The squad moved swiftly, but the leader zombies were on them faster than expected. They were waiting for them, positioned between the buildings, watching with those cold, empty eyes. And then, with a chilling howl, they charged. Rivas' squad fired in unison, the sound of gunshots deafening in the night. But the leader zombies were too fast. One of the creatures lunged at Private Sykes, knocking him to the ground with unnatural strength. "Pull back!" Rivas shouted, but the undead were closing in from all sides. The squad scrambled toward the city center, but the undead were relentless. It was as though the very streets were closing in around them. Back at the command center, Elena's mind raced as she coordinated the final defense. She had just received word from Rivas' squad that they were almost at the city center, but there was no time to wait. The leader zombies were already on the move, and their coordination was becoming more precise with each passing minute. "We need to move now," Elena ordered, her voice cutting through the tension. "We'll use the alleys and side streets to get into position. Malik, you lead the group to the east side. I'll take the west." Malik gave her a sharp nod, but there was no hiding the worry in his eyes. "This is it, Major. We're putting everything on the line now." "I know," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we're not giving up. Not now." In the heart of the town, the city center loomed ahead, a mix of old stone buildings and narrow alleys that would make for an ideal battleground. The team reached their position in the east, using the cover of darkness to their advantage. Rivas' squad was already in position, though their numbers had dwindled since the initial battle. As Rivas crouched behind the ruins of a collapsed wall, he could see the first of the leader zombies emerging from the fog. They were closing in from all directions, their chilling eyes scanning the area, looking for their next target. Rivas took a deep breath, gripping his rifle tightly. "This is it," he muttered. "We hold the line here. Do not let them through." The rest of the squad nodded in grim determination, taking their positions behind the ruins and collapsed buildings. They would fight here, where the last remnants of humanity would make their stand. Elena stood at the front of her team, the weight of the situation sinking in. This was the final fight. The undead were closing in, and the city center was their last line of defense. There was no room for failure. "We hold here," she said, her voice steady. "We fight, we survive. And when it's over, humanity will still stand." As the first of the leader zombies appeared at the edge of the city center, Elena gave the signal. The fight for survival had begun. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the leader zombies advanced, their chilling eyes gleaming in the dim light. The air was thick with tension, the scent of decay and sweat filling Elena's lungs. This was the moment they had been preparing for. There was no turning back. "Take your positions," Elena commanded, her voice cutting through the stillness of the night. Her soldiers, battered and bruised from days of constant fighting, scrambled into place, finding cover in the broken remains of buildings and debris scattered throughout the city center. Rivas' squad, though small, was still holding strong. His eyes darted across the field, focusing on the leader zombies that were gathering near the perimeter, moving in a coordinated formation. They were almost like a hunting pack, each one scanning the area, communicating without words. They were no longer just monsters, they were tacticians, predators. "It's like they know what we're doing," Malik muttered as he crouched beside Elena, his eyes fixed on the advancing threat. "They've been getting smarter with every attack," Elena replied, her jaw clenched in determination. "But they're still just zombies. We can outsmart them." As the leader zombies closed the gap, Elena knew that their only hope was to eliminate the leaders, one by one. If they could take them out, the rest of the horde would lose its direction. They'd become mindless again, easy to pick off. "On my mark, we fire," Elena instructed, her voice steady. "Rivas, hold your fire until I give the signal." The seconds dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Elena's mind was racing. This was their final stand, the last chance for humanity to turn the tide. If they failed, the town would fall, and the undead would continue to spread. "Ready," she whispered, her fingers twitching over her weapon. Rivas, Malik, and the rest of the survivors waited in the shadows, their weapons trained on the leader zombies. The tension in the air was suffocating. Then, just as the first leader zombie stepped into the killing zone, Elena gave the signal. "Fire!" The crack of gunshots echoed through the city center, followed by the screams of the undead as they were caught in a barrage of fire. The leader zombies staggered back, surprised by the sudden assault. But they quickly recovered, their predatory instincts kicking in. The battle had begun. Rivas' squad fired in unison, their shots finding their marks. One leader zombie went down, collapsing into the rubble, but the others pressed forward, undeterred. Elena watched in horror as the remaining leaders seemed to become more aggressive, charging straight at the survivors. "We need to fall back," Malik shouted, but Elena shook her head. "We hold the line. We can't fall back now." The horde of undead continued to pour into the city center, flooding the streets and surrounding the survivors. The first wave of fire had done some damage, but it wasn't enough to stop them. The leader zombies were too powerful, too fast. "Elena!" Rivas shouted as he fired his rifle, keeping the zombies at bay. "We can't hold out much longer. We need a plan B." Elena's mind raced. The barricades were down. They were surrounded. There had to be a way to turn the tide. Then, in the chaos of the battle, she saw it. A narrow alleyway leading to a building that had been reinforced. If they could make it there, they might have a chance to regroup and find some kind of advantage. "Fall back to the alley," Elena ordered. "We move now." The survivors quickly fell into formation, retreating toward the alley. But as they moved, they could feel the ground shifting beneath them. The undead were closing in from every angle, their relentless pursuit making the escape feel like a race against time. Rivas' squad was holding the line, but their numbers were dwindling. One by one, they fell back, covering each other as they moved toward safety. But as they reached the alley, Elena saw a horrifying sight. One of the leader zombies had broken through their defenses and was charging directly at them. "Elena, we're not going to make it," Malik shouted as he took aim, trying to buy them more time. "We have to," Elena shouted back. "Keep moving." The leader zombie was nearly upon them. Its claws swiped at the air, aiming for Malik, but he managed to duck, barely avoiding its strike. However, the distraction allowed the other survivors to reach the alleyway. With a final shot, Rivas managed to take down one of the leader zombies, but the horde was closing in, and they were running out of ammunition. The survivors were exhausted, their bodies bruised and broken from the relentless assault. But the alley offered a small glimmer of hope. They made it to the entrance, quickly retreating into the narrow space. As they moved deeper into the alley, Elena's heart raced. "We've bought ourselves a few minutes," Elena said, breathing heavily. "We regroup here and make our next move." But there was no time to rest. The horde was coming. They could hear the shuffling footsteps, the moans of the undead growing louder. "We need to take the fight to them," Rivas said, his voice grim but resolute. "We have one last chance to end this." Elena looked at her team. The odds were against them, but they had one thing the zombies didn't: humanity's will to fight. The alley was narrow, its dark walls offering little protection from the chaos outside. Elena's breath was ragged, her eyes scanning the group of survivors as they gathered in the shadows. The weight of the battle pressed down on them, but for the first time in what felt like forever, they had a brief moment to breathe. "We've got no time," Rivas said, his voice low and urgent. "They're already moving in on us." Elena nodded, her mind racing. They couldn't stay here. The zombies were closing in, their grotesque forms already filling the streets just beyond the alley's entrance. The moment of rest had only given them the illusion of safety, but the truth was harsh: they were running out of time, running out of options. "We need to fight," she said, her voice hardening with resolve. "This is it. We take the fight to them." Malik, his face grim and bloodied from the earlier fight, checked his weapon and looked at Elena. "Are you sure? We've already lost so many. If we push forward, it's a suicide mission." "We don't push forward," Elena replied, her eyes narrowing. "We trap them. We use the city's layout to our advantage. We lead them into the old courthouse district and set the final trap. If we can take out the remaining leaders, we'll have a shot at surviving." "But the courtyard, it's wide open," Rivas pointed out. "They'll have us pinned in seconds." Elena paused, considering his words. "Then we use the buildings. We fight from cover, picking them off one by one. The moment the leaders fall, we turn the tide." Malik's eyes flickered with hesitation. He glanced at the rest of the survivors, each one worn down by exhaustion but still willing to fight. They had nothing left to lose. "All right," Malik said with a resigned nod. "Let's do it." The survivors moved quickly, slipping out of the alley and taking cover behind the crumbling buildings. Elena led the way, her steps sure despite the heavy weight on her shoulders. They had one shot at this, and they needed to make every moment count. As they reached the edge of the city center, they could hear the horde. The low growls, the shuffling footsteps, the sound of the undead closing in on them from all directions. Elena held up her hand, signaling for the group to stop. She motioned for Rivas and Malik to take their positions on either side, while she moved to the front, where the street led directly to the courtyard. "Ready?" she whispered. Rivas gave a brief nod, his eyes steely. "Ready." Malik checked his rifle and glanced at the others. The survivors were in position, their hearts pounding in anticipation. "On my mark," Elena said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "We lure them in. Move fast." With a sharp whistle, Elena signaled the trap. Immediately, the survivors scattered, drawing the attention of the zombies. As expected, the leader zombies, their cold eyes locked onto their prey, charged forward, eager to finish what they had started. The plan had worked. The horde followed the survivors' movement, funneled into the courtyard, just as Elena had predicted. The leaders, eyes fixated on their prey, led the charge. "Now!" Elena shouted, and the survivors opened fire. The deafening crack of gunshots rang out, echoing across the city. The leaders were caught off guard, their surprise momentarily halting their advance. One of the creatures fell, its body collapsing to the ground in a heap of broken limbs. The survivors continued to fire, each shot precise, aimed at the leader zombies. With every leader that fell, the horde's advance faltered. The rest of the zombies seemed confused, disoriented. Their mindless attacks slowed, their sense of coordination breaking apart. "Keep pushing," Rivas shouted as he took down another leader. The battle raged, and the survivors fought with everything they had left. Elena could feel her limbs shaking with exhaustion, but she kept firing, determined to hold the line. They couldn't let up now. The horde was still coming, but the remaining leaders were falling, one by one. The air was thick with smoke and the scent of gunpowder. The courtyard became a battlefield, a final stand against the encroaching darkness. And with every leader zombie that fell, humanity's last chance to survive grew stronger. Finally, there was a lull in the chaos. The once unified horde had splintered, its leaders dead. The remaining zombies staggered aimlessly, confused by the sudden loss of direction. The survivors, though exhausted and battered, had won their final battle. Elena stood, her chest heaving with heavy breaths as she surveyed the battlefield. Around her, the survivors were still standing, though none without their scars. They had made it. They had survived. Rivas wiped the blood from his face and turned to Elena. "We did it." Elena nodded, her eyes scanning the remaining survivors. "We did," she said quietly. "But this isn't the end." She looked out toward the horizon, where the first light of dawn was breaking. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The world was still full of dangers, both from the undead and the harsh reality of what had been lost. But as long as they fought, as long as they held on, there was always hope. "We rebuild," Elena said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "We fight, and we rebuild." And with that, they turned toward the future, together. End of Part 8. End of story.